The words hit me like a physical blow, even though Gregory Hartwell delivered them with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather. Terence, let's be honest. You just don't have the leadership qualities we're looking for in this organization. We were standing in his corner office on the 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Chicago skyline like a painting I'd never be important enough to own, and he was holding my performance review in one hand while checking his phone with the other. I'd worked at Hartwell Consulting for 4 years, grinding through 60-hour weeks, managing projects that saved clients millions, mentoring junior analysts who'd been promoted past me, and this was my reward. A performance review that rated me meets expectations, with a comment section explaining, in corporate language designed to sound professional while cutting deep, that I lacked executive presence and strategic vision. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, and I felt my jaw tighten, my hands clench at my sides, my entire body fighting the urge to say something I'd regret. "I've given this company everything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, trying to maintain some dignity even as I felt it slipping away. "Every project I've led has come in under budget and ahead of schedule. My client satisfaction scores are higher than anyone else in my division. I've trained half the people who work here." Gregory cut me off with a raised hand, his expression a mix of pity and impatience that made my stomach turn. "And that's exactly the problem, Terence. You're an excellent worker. You execute well. But leadership isn't about doing the work, it's about inspiring others to do the work. It's about vision, about presence, about making people believe in something bigger than themselves." He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if inspiration lived somewhere out there in the skyline. "You're just not that person. And honestly, I don't think you ever will be. Some people are built to lead, and some people are built to follow. There's no shame in knowing which one you are." I walked out of his office 10 minutes later with a 2.3% raise, barely enough to keep up with inflation, and a recommendation to focus on my technical skills instead of pursuing management opportunities. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a tomb, my reflection in the polished metal doors showing a man who looked older than his 33 years, worn down by a system that rewarded performance with platitudes and ambition with humiliation. My co-workers were gathered around the coffee station when I passed, laughing about something I couldn't hear and wouldn't have found funny even if I could. Nobody asked how my review went. Nobody seemed to notice I was there at all. I grabbed my jacket from my desk, told my supervisor I was taking the rest of the day as PTO, and left the building without looking back. The September afternoon was warm and bright, completely at odds with the darkness spreading through my chest, and I walked for blocks without destination, trying to process what had just happened and failing spectacularly. My apartment in Pilsen was a one-bedroom I'd lived in since moving to Chicago 5 years ago, back when I thought consulting would be a stepping stone to something greater. The furniture was minimal and mostly second-hand, a couch I'd bought off Craigslist, a desk from IKEA, a bed that creaked every time I turned over at night. The walls were decorated with motivational posters I'd put up in a moment of optimism years ago, phrases about success and perseverance that now felt like mockery. Dream big. Leaders are made, not born. Your only limit is you. I stood in my living room staring at those posters, feeling something crack inside me that had been holding together through sheer force of will. Gregory's words kept echoing in my mind. "You're just not that person. You never will be." What if he was right? What if I'd been lying to myself for years, believing I had potential that simply didn't exist, chasing a version of success that was never meant for people like me? I made dinner that night, instant ramen with frozen vegetables, the meal of someone too defeated to care about nutrition, and ate it standing at my kitchen counter while scrolling through LinkedIn. Every post seemed designed to remind me of my failures. Former classmates announcing promotions to vice president, people I'd started with at Hartwell celebrating their moves to better companies, thought leaders sharing wisdom about unlocking your leadership potential that felt personally insulting given my afternoon. My bank account showed $3,200 in savings after 4 years of working for one of Chicago's top consulting firms. Rent was $1,400 a month for this glorified closet. Student loans took another $850. My car payment was $320 for a used Honda that barely started in winter. I was 33 years old, college-educated, hard-working, and going absolutely nowhere. The American dream had become the American treadmill. Endless motion with no forward progress, just exhaustion and the slowly dawning realization that maybe the system wasn't broken, maybe I was just never supposed to win in the first place. Sleep that night was fractured and restless, filled with dreams where I stood in front of boardrooms full of people who laughed every time I tried to speak, where Gregory's face multiplied into a dozen versions of itself, all shaking their heads in synchronized disappointment. I woke up at 5:17 a.m. to my neighbor's dog barking through the thin walls, and I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind already spinning with the same thoughts that had kept me up half the night. What was I doing with my life? When had I accepted that mediocrity was my ceiling? My father had worked in a steel mill for 30 years, came home every day with his hands rough and his back aching, and he'd always told me that education was the key, that if I got my degree, wore a tie, worked in an office, I'd have opportunities he never had. But here I was, degree from a decent state school, tie hanging in my closet, office job that paid just enough to survive, and I felt more trapped than he'd ever been. At least his work had been honest, tangible, real. What did I do? I made PowerPoint presentations for companies that would forget my name the moment the project ended. The weekend crawled by with the specific torture of having nothing to do but think about everything wrong with your life. Saturday I tried to work out at the cheap gym in my building, but gave up after 20 minutes because I couldn't stop replaying Gregory's words in my head. You're just not that person. I showered, made breakfast I didn't eat, and spent the afternoon applying to jobs on Indeed and LinkedIn, senior analyst positions at other consulting firms, project manager roles at tech companies, anything that might represent forward motion instead of this suffocating stagnation. By evening, I'd sent out 14 applications and received 3 automated rejection emails. The efficiency of modern disappointment was almost impressive. Sunday was worse because I had nothing to distract me from the existential dread of Monday morning, the prospect of walking back into Hartwell Consulting, seeing Gregory in the hallway, sitting at my desk, knowing that everyone who mattered had already decided I was going nowhere. I ordered pizza I barely touched and watched television I didn't absorb, just noise to fill the silence of an apartment that felt more like a cell with every passing hour. Monday came with the inevitability of a death sentence, and I dressed in the same business casual uniform I'd worn 1,000 times. Khakis, button-down shirt, the one blazer I owned that was starting to fray at the cuffs. The commute on the Red Line was packed with bodies, the smell of coffee and resignation. Everyone staring at their phones to avoid eye contact with the reality of their lives. I emerged at Monroe Station and walked the 3 blocks to Hartwell Consulting's building, a glass tower that had once impressed me and now just felt like a monument to other people's success. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk where guards barely glanced at badges anymore, too bored by their own jobs to care about ours. I took the elevator to the 14th floor, watched the numbers climb with a sense of dread that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable, and stepped out into the open-plan office space I'd occupied for 4 years. Nothing had changed. The same desks, the same people, the same recycled air and artificial lighting. Only I had changed. Or rather, only I had finally seen clearly what I'd been refusing to acknowledge for years. The next 3 months passed in a grey fog of going through the motions. I showed up at 8:30, left at 5:30, did my work with competent mediocrity, and stopped pretending I cared about advancement or recognition. During team meetings, I contributed the minimum required to avoid criticism, but never volunteered ideas or insights. When younger analysts asked for mentorship, I helped them, but without the investment I used to bring, why train my replacements with enthusiasm? Gregory barely acknowledged my existence anymore, which was somehow both a relief and an insult. I'd become invisible, a piece of office furniture that performed its function without requiring attention or maintenance. My life had contracted to its smallest possible radius: work, commute, apartment, sleep, repeat. I stopped applying to other jobs after the 50th rejection. I stopped working out entirely, I stopped calling my sister in Atlanta, who kept asking when I'd visit. I stopped doing anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival, because what was the point? I was 33 years old and already finished, already at my ceiling, already everything I was ever going to be. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, cold and dark by 5 p.m. in that way Chicago winters have, of making you forget the sun exists, when something inside me finally broke completely. I'd stayed late, not because I needed to, but because going home to my empty apartment felt worse than staying in my empty office, and I was packing up around 7:30 when I knocked my bag off my desk. Everything spilled across the floor. Laptop, phone, wallet, pens, and a book I'd completely forgotten was in there. I picked it up, recognizing it immediately even though I hadn't looked at it in over a year. Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. My father had given it to me right before he died 3 years ago, pressed it into my hands at the hospital and said, "Son, nobody's coming to save you. You have to save yourself." I'd thanked him, brought it home, and buried it in my bag where it had lived ever since. Unread, just another piece of guilt I carried around. Now sitting on the floor of my office with my belongings scattered around me like debris from a wreck, I opened it to a random page and started reading. The chapter I'd opened to was titled The Ultimate Dichotomy, and the first lines hit me like cold water to the face. To implement extreme ownership requires checking your ego and operating with a high degree of humility, admitting mistakes, taking ownership, and developing a plan to overcome challenges are integral to any successful team. I read those words sitting on the floor of my empty office, the building silent except for the distant hum of HVAC systems and the occasional ding of an elevator nobody was using, and something shifted in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but something sharper, more dangerous. Clarity. For 3 months I'd been blaming Gregory, blaming the system, blaming corporate America for my stagnation. But what if I'd been complicit in my own defeat? What if Gregory hadn't crushed my leadership potential? What if I'd simply never developed it in the first place, too busy being competent and comfortable to risk being anything more? I stayed in that office reading until almost midnight, devouring chapter after chapter of extreme ownership, like a man who'd been starving without realizing it. The book told stories of Navy SEALs in combat situations, making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, and on the surface it had nothing to do with my corporate consulting job. But underneath the military language was a philosophy that cut straight to the bone. Nobody is coming to save you, excuses are poison, and the only person responsible for your life is you. Every failure I'd experienced, every passed-over promotion, every ignored idea, every moment of feeling invisible, I'd blamed on external forces. But what had I actually done to change my circumstances? Had I built anything outside of work? Had I developed skills Gregory couldn't control? Had I taken ownership of my career, or had I just shown up and hoped someone would notice I deserved better? The answers made me uncomfortable in a way that felt almost cleansing, like lancing an infection that had been festering for years. I left the building around 12:30 a.m., the security guard looking surprised to see anyone still there, and instead of going straight home, I walked. Chicago in late November was brutal, wind cutting through my coat, temperature in the low 30s, the kind of cold that made your eyes water. But I needed the physical discomfort to match the emotional reckoning happening inside me. I walked south along Michigan Avenue, past the Art Institute and Millennium Park, past tourists bundled up taking selfies with their breath visible in the night air, past homeless men huddled in doorways with cardboard signs. One of them, an older man with grey in his beard and gaps in his teeth, called out as I passed, "You look like you lost something, brother." I stopped, pulled a $10 bill from my wallet and handed it to him. "Yeah," I said, "but I think I'm about to find it." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded like he understood something I was only beginning to grasp. Good luck with that. Most people never do. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m., and instead of collapsing into bed like I normally would, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started writing. Not a journal entry, not therapy, a plan. Extreme ownership had made one thing brutally clear. If I wanted my life to change, I had to change my life, and that meant taking concrete action instead of waiting for permission or opportunity. I wrote down everything I was good at, project management, client relations, training and development, synthesizing complex information into actionable insights. Then I wrote down what I actually wanted: to lead, to build something meaningful, to help other people develop skills that organizations undervalued. The intersection of those two lists pointed toward something I'd never seriously considered before: starting my own leadership training company. Not consulting in the traditional sense, there were a million firms doing that already, but something focused specifically on developing leadership skills in people like me, people who'd been told they lacked potential by bosses who couldn't recognize talent that didn't look like their own reflection. The idea felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying, which I was learning meant it was probably the right direction. I spent the rest of that night researching leadership training programs, corporate development budgets, competitors in the market, pricing models, certification requirements. By the time the sun rose over Lake Michigan, painting my apartment in shades of orange and pink, I had the skeleton of a business plan and something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. I called in sick to work that Wednesday, the first time I'd done that in over 2 years, and spent the entire day building out my concept. I'd call it Elevate Leadership Institute, focused on developing leadership potential in mid-level professionals who'd been overlooked or underestimated by their organizations. The curriculum would blend practical skills with mindset development, teaching people not just what leaders do but how leaders think. And unlike most corporate training that felt like checking boxes, this would be real, intensive, challenging, transformative. I had no funding, no clients, no credibility, and no guarantee it would work. But for the first time since my father died, I felt like I was honoring what he'd tried to teach me. That ownership of your life starts with refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own. I went back to work on Thursday with a strange sense of calm, like I was operating undercover in my own life. Everything looked the same office, the same people, the same Gregory walking past my desk without acknowledging my existence. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I'd crossed some invisible threshold where the job stopped defining me and started being just a means to an end. A paycheck funding something bigger that nobody here could see or control. I did my work with efficient detachment, attended meetings where I contributed just enough to avoid questions, and at 5:30 p.m. I packed my bag and left without lingering. My evenings and weekends became dedicated to building Elevate Leadership Institute, working with the same intensity I'd once given to Hartwell Consulting, but now with actual investment in the outcome. I registered the LLC, built a basic website, started outlining curriculum modules based on everything I'd learned about what actually develops leaders versus what corporations pretend develops leaders. The first challenge was credibility. Who was I to teach leadership when I'd been explicitly told I lacked it? But extreme ownership had taught me something crucial. You don't wait until you're qualified to start. You become qualified by starting. I began reaching out to my network, carefully at first, testing the waters with former colleagues who'd left Hartwell for other companies. I'm developing a leadership training program focused on mid-level professionals, I'd say. Would you be willing to give me feedback on the curriculum? Most people ignored the message, but a few responded with genuine interest, and those few became my initial focus group. I met them for coffee, bought them lunch, picked their brains about what they wished someone had taught them earlier in their careers. Every conversation refined my understanding of the gap I was trying to fill. Organizations invested heavily in executive development, but almost nothing in middle management, assuming leadership was either innate or would somehow develop through osmosis. By January, I had a complete 12-week curriculum covering everything from emotional intelligence and strategic thinking to difficult conversations and organizational dynamics. I'd invested $4,800 of my savings, money I absolutely couldn't afford to lose, into creating professional materials, getting a business license, and building a legitimate online presence. My apartment had transformed into a makeshift headquarters, desk covered with notes and outlines, whiteboard on my living room wall mapping out marketing strategies, laptop always open to some document about learning theory or adult development. I was sleeping 5 hours a night, working my day job on autopilot, and pouring every ounce of creative energy into something that existed only in potential. My sister called one Saturday afternoon and asked when I'd visit Atlanta, and I realized with a start that I'd stopped returning her calls entirely, too consumed with building to maintain relationships. Soon, I lied, knowing I wouldn't leave Chicago until this thing either succeeded or failed completely. The first real test came in February when I launched my beta program, a condensed 4-week version of the full curriculum offered at a steep discount to 10 guinea pigs willing to take a chance on an unknown trainer. I advertised in LinkedIn groups for project managers and mid-level leaders, posted in Reddit communities about professional development, and sent targeted emails to people in my extended network. For 3 days, nothing happened. 0 sign-ups, 0 interest. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the registration page, refreshing it compulsively like a junkie, wondering if I'd just wasted months of my life building something nobody wanted. On day 4, someone signed up, a woman named Angela, who worked as an operations manager at a healthcare company, and wrote in her application, "I've been told I'm not leadership material so many times I started believing it. I want to prove them wrong." I almost cried reading that. By the end of the week, I had 7 sign-ups, not 10, but enough to run the pilot program and gather real data about whether this thing actually worked. The first session happened on a Tuesday evening in a rented conference room at a co-working space in the Loop. Nothing fancy, just a room with tables and chairs and a whiteboard, but it was mine. 7 people showed up, all of them carrying the same energy I recognized from my own mirror, talented but overlooked, ambitious but dismissed, hungry for something their organizations weren't providing. I'd prepared obsessively, rehearsed my opening, planned every minute of the 3-hour session, but when I actually stood at the front of that room and introduced myself, something unexpected happened. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. The words came out clear and confident, not because I was faking it, but because I finally believed in what I was teaching. I told them my story, Gregory's office, the performance review, the crushing realization that nobody was going to give me permission to lead, and I watched recognition dawn on their faces. They'd all been in that office. They'd all heard some version of, "You're not leadership material." And now, we were going to prove every single one of those voices wrong, together. I went back to work on Thursday with a strange sense of calm, like I was operating undercover in my own life. Everything looked the same office, the same people, the same Gregory walking past my desk without acknowledging my existence. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I'd crossed some invisible threshold where the job stopped defining me and started being just a means to an end, a paycheck funding something bigger that nobody here could see or control. I did my work with efficient detachment, attended meetings where I contributed just enough to avoid questions, and at 5:30 p.m. I packed my bag and left without lingering. My evenings and weekends became dedicated to building Elevate Leadership Institute, working with the same intensity I'd once given to Hartwell Consulting, but now with actual investment in the outcome. I registered the LLC, built a basic website, started outlining curriculum modules based on everything I'd learned about what actually develops leaders versus what corporations pretend develops leaders. The first challenge was credibility. Who was I to teach leadership when I'd been explicitly told I lacked it? But extreme ownership had taught me something crucial. You don't wait until you're qualified to start. You become qualified by starting. I began reaching out to my network, carefully at first, testing the waters with former colleagues who'd left Hartwell for other companies. "I'm developing a leadership training program focused on mid-level professionals," I'd say. "Would you be willing to give me feedback on the curriculum?" Most people ignored the message, but a few responded with genuine interest, and those few became my initial focus group. I met them for coffee, bought them lunch, picked their brains about what they wished someone had taught them earlier in their careers. Every conversation refined my understanding of the gap I was trying to fill. Organizations invested heavily in executive development, but almost nothing in middle management, assuming leadership was either innate or would somehow develop through osmosis. By January, I had a complete 12-week curriculum covering everything from emotional intelligence and strategic thinking to difficult conversations and organizational dynamics. I'd invested $4,800 of my savings, money I absolutely couldn't afford to lose, into creating professional materials, getting a business license and building a legitimate online presence. My apartment had transformed into a makeshift headquarters, desk covered with notes and outlines, whiteboard on my living room wall mapping out marketing strategies, laptop always open to some document about learning theory or adult development. I was sleeping 5 hours a night, working my day job on autopilot, and pouring every ounce of creative energy into something that existed only in potential. My sister called one Saturday afternoon and asked when I'd visit Atlanta, and I realized with a start that I'd stopped returning her calls entirely, too consumed with building to maintain relationships. Soon, I lied, knowing I wouldn't leave Chicago until this thing either succeeded or failed completely. The first real test came in February when I launched my beta program, a condensed 4-week version of the full curriculum offered at a steep discount to 10 guinea pigs willing to take a chance on an unknown trainer. I advertised in LinkedIn groups for project managers and mid-level leaders, posted in Reddit communities about professional development, and sent targeted emails to people in my extended network. For 3 days, nothing happened. 0 sign-ups, 0 interest. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the registration page, refreshing it compulsively like a junkie, wondering if I'd just wasted months of my life building something nobody wanted. On day 4, someone signed up, a woman named Angela, who worked as an operations manager at a healthcare company and wrote in her application, "I've been told I'm not leadership material so many times I started believing it. I want to prove them wrong." I almost cried reading that. By the end of the week, I had 7 sign-ups. Not 10, but enough to run the pilot program and gather real data about whether this thing actually worked. The first session happened on a Tuesday evening in a rented conference room at a co-working space in the Loop. Nothing fancy, just a room with tables and chairs and a whiteboard, but it was mine. 7 people showed up, all of them carrying the same energy I recognized from my own mirror. Talented but overlooked, ambitious but dismissed, hungry for something their organizations weren't providing. I'd prepared obsessively, rehearsed my opening, planned every minute of the 3-hour session, but when I actually stood at the front of that room and introduced myself, something unexpected happened. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. The words came out clear and confident, not because I was faking it, but because I finally believed in what I was teaching. I told them my story, Gregory's office, the performance review, the crushing realization that nobody was going to give me permission to lead, and I watched recognition dawn on their faces. They'd all been in that office. They'd all heard some version of, "You're not leadership material." And now, we were going to prove every single one of those voices wrong, together. The beta program ran for 4 weeks, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and by the 3rd session I knew I had something real. The participants weren't just showing up. They were engaged, asking questions, challenging assumptions, sharing vulnerable stories about their own career struggles. Angela, the operations manager who'd been my first sign-up, started speaking up in meetings at her job and got assigned to lead a cross-functional project. Another participant, a guy named Deshawn who worked in IT, used techniques from our conflict resolution module to finally address a toxic dynamic with his manager. They weren't massive wins, but they were concrete evidence that what I was teaching actually translated into results. I collected feedback obsessively after every session, adjusted the curriculum based on what resonated and what fell flat, and by the end of the 4 weeks, I had testimonials that made my chest tight with something between pride and disbelief. "This program changed how I see myself," one person wrote. "For the first time, I believe I actually can lead." At Hartwell Consulting, nothing had changed, and everything had changed. Externally, I was still the same mid-level analyst Gregory had written off, still sitting at the same desk, doing the same work. But internally, I was someone else entirely, someone building an empire in secret, someone with purpose beyond a paycheck, someone who no longer needed validation from people who couldn't see my value. During a team meeting in March, Gregory announced that the company had lost another major client and would be implementing efficiency measures, corporate speak for likely layoffs. People around the conference table shifted nervously, exchanging worried glances. But I felt nothing. No fear, no anxiety, just cold calculation. If they laid me off, I'd have severance to invest in Elevate. If they kept me, I'd continue using their paycheck to fund my escape. Either way, I won. That realization was more liberating than any promotion could have been. I launched the full 12-week program in April with a cohort of 15 people, charging $200 per person, not cheap, but positioned as an investment in their future that their companies wouldn't make. The revenue, $18,000, was more money than I'd ever made from anything outside my salary, and I immediately reinvested most of it into better materials, professional certifications, and marketing. Word was spreading organically through my first participants, who were seeing real results and telling their networks. By May, I had a waiting list for the next cohort. By June, I was running 2 concurrent programs, one on Tuesday-Thursday evenings, another on Saturday mornings for people whose work schedules made weeknights impossible. I was exhausted in a way that felt completely different from Hartwell exhaustion. This was the tiredness that comes from building something meaningful, from pushing yourself toward a goal you actually care about reaching. The breaking point at Hartwell came on a Wednesday afternoon in July, when Gregory called me into his office for what he said was a quick check-in. I sat across from him in that same chair where he'd delivered my soul-crushing performance review 9 months earlier, and he leaned back with his fingers steepled, wearing an expression that was trying for paternal but landing closer to condescending. "Terence, I've been watching your work lately, and I have to say you seem checked out. Your output is fine, but there's no passion, no initiative. Is everything okay?" The question was so absurd I almost laughed. Was everything okay? I was running a successful business he knew nothing about, developing actual leaders while he played corporate politics, building something real while he managed the slow decline of a firm that had stopped innovating years ago. But I kept my face neutral, professional. "Everything's fine, Gregory. Just focused on doing my job well." He frowned slightly, unsatisfied with that answer. "Well, I need you focused. We've got some opportunities coming up that might be good for your development." Empty promises, the same ones he'd been dangling for years. I left that meeting and went back to my desk, but instead of opening my laptop, I just sat there staring at the Chicago skyline through the office windows, at the city spreading out in all directions, full of possibility and people chasing dreams both realistic and impossible. I'd been at Hartwell for 4 years, and for 3 of those years I'd been waiting for Gregory to notice me, waiting for the company to invest in my development, waiting for someone to give me permission to be more than they thought I could be. But the last 9 months had taught me something extreme ownership had tried to tell me from the first page. Waiting is just another form of surrender. Nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to hand me a leadership role or recognize my potential or apologize for underestimating me. If I wanted my life to change, I had to be the one to change it, and I already had. I opened my laptop, typed out a 2-week notice letter with no explanation beyond pursuing other opportunities, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I packed my personal items, walked to the elevator, and left Hartwell Consulting for the last time. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just left. The 2 weeks after I quit were simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like jumping off a cliff and discovering mid-fall that you might actually know how to fly. I'd saved $11,000 from my Elevate revenue, enough to cover rent and basic expenses for about 4 months if I lived carefully, which meant I had 4 months to turn this side project into a real business, or face the humiliation of crawling back to corporate consulting with my tail between my legs. The difference now was that failure felt like my failure, not something being done to me by a system rigged against my success. I could live with losing if I'd actually fought, but I couldn't live with never trying. My apartment became my full-time office. I set up proper lighting for video calls, bought a decent microphone, organized my materials into a system that didn't involve papers scattered across every surface. For the first time since college, I woke up excited about the day ahead instead of dreading it. And that shift in energy was worth more than any salary. August brought validation I hadn't dared hope for. One of my early participants, a woman named Jennifer who worked at a mid-sized tech company, got promoted to Director of Operations. She sent me an email with the subject line, "It happened," and in the body she'd written, "Everything you taught us about strategic thinking and executive presence, I used it in my promotion interview, and they said I was exactly what they were looking for. Thank you for seeing potential in me that my last 3 managers missed." I read that email 5 times, saved it in a folder labeled "Why This Matters," and then immediately reached out to ask if she'd be willing to do a video testimonial. She agreed, and her 3-minute testimonial became the cornerstone of my marketing. A real person with a real job, describing real results from my program. Within a week of posting it on LinkedIn, I had 47 inquiries about the next cohort. Applications poured in from all over the country, people who'd been told they weren't leadership material and were desperate to prove otherwise. By September, exactly 1 year after Gregory had told me I'd never be a leader, I was running 4 concurrent cohorts of 15 people each, generating $72,000 per quarter in revenue. I'd hired my first employee, a former teacher named Marcus, who'd taken my program, and showed such natural talent for facilitation that I brought him on to help deliver sessions. The business was still small, still scrappy, still operating out of my apartment and rented conference rooms, but it was growing with a momentum that felt almost inevitable. I'd developed a reputation in professional development circles as someone who actually understood what middle managers needed, someone who'd been in their shoes and figured out how to climb out. LinkedIn posts about my program got thousands of likes. People started reaching out asking if I did corporate contracts, if I could bring my training in-house to their organizations. Every door I'd been trying to knock down from the outside was suddenly opening from the inside, and it was dizzying how fast things could shift once you stopped asking permission and started creating value. The moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for came on a Thursday afternoon in October, when I received a LinkedIn message from someone named Patricia Chen with the subject line, "Training Opportunity, Hartwell Consulting." My stomach did a strange flip as I opened it. Patricia was apparently the new Director of Learning and Development at Hartwell, a position that hadn't existed when I worked there, which meant Gregory had finally acknowledged what I'd been saying for years, that the company needed to invest in developing its people. Her message was professional and direct. "We're looking for an external partner to deliver leadership development training to our mid-level managers. Your program came highly recommended by several people in our network. Would you be available for a call to discuss a potential contract?" I read the message 3 times, feeling something complicated twist in my chest. Gregory's company wanted to hire me to teach leadership to the people he'd told me weren't leadership material, including implicitly the version of me who'd sat in his office being told I'd never be enough. I scheduled the call for the following Tuesday and spent the weekend preparing a proposal that was simultaneously generous and pointed. I'd charge them $85,000 for a 6-month engagement training 30 managers, more than I'd made in an entire year as their employee, but reasonable compared to what other corporate training programs cost. The call went better than expected. Patricia was sharp, genuinely interested in outcomes rather than just checking boxes, and she'd done her homework on my program. "We've had 3 former Hartwell employees go through your training, and all 3 have shown remarkable improvement in their leadership capabilities," she said. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. I'd like to propose bringing you in for a pilot program starting in January." We talked logistics, outcomes, success metrics, and by the end of the call, I had a verbal agreement pending contract review. She mentioned, almost casually, "You'll probably run into some familiar faces. Gregory Hartwell is actually one of the managers we want to include in the program. He's been struggling with his team's morale lately." I kept my voice steady as I said that would be fine, but inside I was screaming. Gregory was going to be my student. The man who'd told me I lacked leadership potential was going to sit in my class and learn from me. Karma wasn't just real. It was poetic. The contract arrived in mid-November, and I spent 2 days reviewing every clause with an attorney I'd hired specifically for this moment. No way was I signing anything that could come back to bite me later. The terms were straightforward. 6-month engagement, 30 participants divided into 2 cohorts, $85,000 paid in 3 installments, with performance metrics tied to participant feedback and measurable behavior change. I signed it on a Friday afternoon, scanned it back to Patricia, and then sat at my kitchen table staring at the confirmation email for a long time. This was really happening. In 6 weeks, I'd walk back into Hartwell Consulting not as the dismissed analyst they'd underestimated, but as the expert. They were paying premium rates to fix problems they'd created by undervaluing their own people. The symmetry was almost too perfect, like the universe had been taking notes and decided to hand me the exact revenge I'd never dared imagine. Not destruction, but dignified success that made my old life look small by comparison. I spent December preparing obsessively, customizing the Elevate curriculum specifically for Hartwell's culture and challenges. I interviewed 5 current employees confidentially to understand what was really broken beneath the surface. Turned out Gregory wasn't the only leader struggling with morale, and the company's reputation had gotten so bad they were having trouble recruiting talent. People joined, realized the development opportunities were non-existent, and left within 18 months. The revolving door was costing them millions in recruitment and training costs, but nobody in leadership wanted to acknowledge that the problem was leadership itself. My program would force that acknowledgement, not through accusation, but through contrast. By showing them what actual leadership development looked like, I'd reveal how badly they'd been failing at it. Christmas came and went, with minimal celebration, just a phone call with my sister, where I finally told her what I'd been building. "Terence, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Daddy would be too. You did exactly what he taught you. You took ownership." That night I pulled Extreme Ownership off my shelf, looked at my father's handwriting in the inscription, and felt his presence like he was sitting next to me, nodding in approval. The first session at Hartwell happened on a frigid Tuesday morning in mid-January, in the same 14th floor conference room where I'd attended 1,000 pointless meetings as an employee. I arrived 30 minutes early, set up my materials with deliberate calm, and tested the AV equipment while my heart hammered against my ribs. At 8:55 a.m., participants started filtering in. Some faces I recognized, most I didn't, and they took seats around the large table with the weary resignation of people forced into mandatory corporate training. Then Gregory walked in. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, his expensive suit hanging a little loose like he'd lost weight. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I watched recognition flicker across his face. Confusion first, then surprise, then something that might have been embarrassment or respect or both. He sat down at the far end of the table without saying anything, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone slightly uncomfortable before I began. "Good morning. My name is Terence Williams, and I'm the founder of Elevate Leadership Institute. Over the next 6 months, we're going to work together to develop the leadership capabilities that most organizations talk about but rarely teach. Things like strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, difficult conversations, and building high-trust teams." I paused, making eye contact with each person in the room, landing on Gregory last. "Some of you might be wondering what qualifies me to teach this. Fair question. 4 years ago, I worked here as an analyst. I was told by my manager that I lacked the potential to lead, that some people are built to follow and I should accept that reality." The room went completely silent. That manager was wrong. Not because I was secretly great at leadership. I wasn't. I had no idea how to lead. But he was wrong about potential being fixed, about some people having it and others not. Leadership is a skill, and skills can be learned by anyone willing to do the work. That's what we're here to do. I watched Gregory's face go through several emotions. Shock, discomfort, something that might have been shame. Several other participants glanced his way, putting pieces together, and I could see the dynamic shifting in real time. The session ran for 4 hours with a break in the middle, and by the end I knew I had them. The content was solid. Exercises that forced self-reflection, frameworks that made complex ideas accessible, discussions that revealed everyone's shared struggles with leadership in ways that built immediate rapport. But what really landed was the authenticity. These people had been through countless corporate training programs that felt like checkbox exercises delivered by consultants who'd never lived their reality. I had lived it. I'd sat where they were sitting, feeling undervalued and overlooked, wondering if I'd ever be seen as more than my current title. That credibility couldn't be bought or faked, and it transformed me from just another trainer into someone they actually wanted to learn from. During the break, 3 people approached me privately to say thank you, not for the content, but for making them feel seen. One woman, a project manager named Keisha, said quietly, "I needed to hear that I'm not crazy for thinking I could do more. They've been telling me for 2 years I'm not ready." I looked her in the eyes and said, "You're ready. You just need the skills. That's what we're going to build." She nodded, blinking back tears, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me like a cloak. This wasn't just about my redemption anymore. It was about theirs too. Over the next 3 months, I watched something remarkable happen. People who'd been beaten down by Hartwell's culture started standing taller, speaking up in meetings, taking initiative instead of waiting for permission. The transformation wasn't overnight or dramatic. It was incremental, showing up in small moments that accumulated into genuine change. Keisha, the project manager who'd been told she wasn't ready, used techniques from our strategic communication module to pitch a process improvement initiative that saved her department $200,000 annually. Another participant, a guy named Robert, who'd been struggling with a toxic team dynamic, applied our conflict resolution framework and turned his worst performer into his strongest advocate. These weren't theoretical wins. They were measurable results that Patricia documented carefully, knowing she'd need to justify the investment to executives who viewed training as an expense rather than an asset. After the 3rd month, she sent me an email. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Leadership wants to extend the contract and expand to more managers." Gregory remained quiet through most of the sessions, participating when required but never volunteering, his body language oscillating between defensive and contemplative. I didn't call him out or try to humiliate him. That would have undermined everything I was teaching about dignity and respect, but I also didn't pretend our history didn't exist. During a module on receiving feedback, I used my own story as a case study without naming him directly. A leader once told me I lacked potential. He delivered it as fact rather than opinion, with no specific examples or development plan. That kind of feedback doesn't help people grow, it just makes them quit or comply. The room sat with that for a moment, and I saw Gregory shift in his seat, his jaw tight. The alternative is feedback that's specific, actionable, and focused on behavior rather than identity. Not you lack leadership potential, but here are 3 specific skills you need to develop, and here's how we'll work on them together. Several people nodded, recognizing their own experiences in that dynamic. The real breakthrough with Gregory came during month 4, in a session focused on vulnerability and leadership. We'd been discussing Brené Brown's research on shame and courage, and I'd asked each person to share a moment when they'd failed as a leader and what they'd learned from it. The exercise was designed to build trust and normalize failure as part of growth, but I knew it was risky. Some people would deflect, others would share surface-level stories that revealed nothing real. When it was Gregory's turn, he was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. Then he looked up, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "About 18 months ago, I told someone on my team that they lacked leadership potential. I said it casually, like it was obvious, without thinking about how it would land or what it would do to their confidence." He paused, glancing briefly at me before continuing. "That person quit shortly after, and in the time since, I've watched them build something more successful than anything I've accomplished. I was wrong, not just about their potential, but about how I approached development entirely. I treated it like you either had it or you didn't, instead of something that could be taught. That failure cost me a good employee. Worse, it probably cost them months of unnecessary self-doubt." The room was absolutely silent. I could feel everyone processing what Gregory had just admitted, the weight of that vulnerability in a corporate culture that usually rewarded hiding weakness. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for sharing that. It takes courage to acknowledge when we've harmed someone, even unintentionally. The question now is, what do you do differently going forward?" Gregory took a breath, seemed to consider carefully before responding. "I've started asking my team members what they want to develop, rather than telling them what they're not. I'm trying to see potential as something I help create rather than something I judge. It's harder than I expected. I have to fight my instinct to categorize people quickly, but I'm trying. It wasn't an apology, not directly, but it was acknowledgement, and somehow that mattered more. The conversation moved on to other participants, but something had shifted in the room. Gregory had stopped performing and started learning, which meant maybe the program was working even on the people who needed it most. By May, the results were undeniable. Patricia presented metrics to Hartwell's executive team showing that participants in my program had 30% higher engagement scores, 25% better performance reviews, and were being promoted at twice the rate of non-participants. The retention data was even more striking. Not a single person who completed the program had left the company in the 6 months after, compared to 22% turnover in similar cohorts who hadn't gone through training. The executives, faced with numbers they couldn't argue with, approved not just an extension, but an expansion. They wanted me to train every manager in the company over the next 2 years, a contract worth $680,000. I negotiated hard, knowing my value now in ways I hadn't when I was their employee, and landed on $750,000 with quarterly deliverables and autonomy over curriculum design. When I signed that contract, I thought about the performance review Gregory had given me 2 years earlier, the one that rated me meets expectations and suggested I focus on technical skills. The employee he'd undervalued was now being paid nearly 5 times his annual salary to fix the leadership problems he embodied. The expanded contract meant I needed to elevate beyond just me and Marcus. By June, I'd hired 3 more facilitators, all people who'd gone through my program and showed exceptional ability to teach others, and moved operations out of my apartment into a small office space in the West Loop. The office wasn't fancy, just 200 square feet with a conference room, a few desks and windows that actually opened, but walking in every morning felt like stepping into proof that the thing I'd built in desperation had become legitimate. We had business cards, a company bank account with 6 figures in it, a CRM system tracking hundreds of clients, and a reputation spreading through corporate Chicago faster than any advertising could have achieved. Companies I'd never heard of were reaching out asking if we did custom programs. Recruiters called weekly, trying to poach my facilitators. Industry publications wanted interviews about our methodology. The success was dizzying and exhausting, and deeply, profoundly satisfying in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. What surprised me most wasn't the business growth. I'd worked hard enough that success felt somewhat inevitable, but how much the work itself still mattered to me. Every cohort had at least 3 or 4 people who reminded me of the version of myself who'd sat in Gregory's office being told I wasn't enough, and watching them develop confidence and skills felt more important than any revenue number. A woman named Jasmine, who'd been stuck as a senior analyst for 6 years, used our program to finally articulate her value and negotiate a promotion to associate director. A guy named David, who'd been on the verge of quitting consulting entirely, rediscovered his passion for the work once he understood how to lead instead of just execute. These transformations weren't abstractions or case studies. They were real people rebuilding their professional identities in real time, and I got to witness it every single week. Extreme ownership had taught me that leadership was about taking responsibility for outcomes, but what I was learning now was that real leadership meant creating conditions for others to discover their own power. The relationship with Gregory evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. After the 6-month program ended, he asked to meet for coffee, not as student and teacher, but as 2 people trying to understand what had happened between them. We met at a place in the Loop on a Saturday morning in July, the city buzzing with weekend energy, and sat at a corner table nursing overpriced lattes while construction noise drifted through open windows. "I owe you an apology," Gregory started, not wasting time on small talk. "Not just for that review, but for creating a culture where people like you felt invisible. I built my career on being the smartest person in the room, and somewhere along the way, I started seeing everyone else as either threats or tools. You were neither. You were talented and ambitious and exactly what the company needed, but I couldn't see it because I was too busy protecting my position." He looked genuinely pained, like this realization had cost him something to reach. I took a sip of coffee, considering my response carefully. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally, meaning it more than I'd expected. "But I need you to understand something. You didn't break me. You broke the illusion I'd been carrying that hard work and competence were enough, that someone would eventually notice and reward my potential. That illusion needed to break. What happened after? Building Elevate, developing real leadership skills, learning to bet on myself. That was all me taking ownership of my life instead of waiting for your approval." Gregory nodded slowly, processing that. "Your program taught me something I'd somehow missed in 20 years of management, that my job isn't to judge who has potential. It's to develop potential in everyone willing to do the work. I've been trying to apply that with my current team, and it's hard. My instinct is still to sort people quickly into categories, but I'm trying." We talked for another hour, two men who'd once been on opposite sides of a power dynamic now speaking as something closer to equals, and when we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. By September, 2 years exactly since that devastating performance review, Elevate Leadership Institute had trained over 300 people, had active contracts with 7 companies, and was generating $1.2 million in annual revenue. I'd moved into a better apartment, paid off my student loans entirely, started contributing to my sister's kids' college funds, and hired a business manager so I could focus on curriculum development rather than administrative tasks. The business had grown beyond what I could control directly, which meant I'd built something that could survive and thrive without my constant intervention, exactly the kind of leadership I'd been teaching. But the moment that made everything feel real came on a Thursday afternoon when Patricia called with news I hadn't anticipated. Hartwell Consulting's board had decided to restructure leadership, and they'd asked her to recommend candidates for a new VP of Talent Development role. "I recommended you," she said simply. "The board wants to interview you next week. It would be a significant role, overseeing all learning and development across the company, building the systems and culture we should have had years ago. Salary would be $280,000 plus equity." I sat with that offer for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. Validation, vindication, the exact position I'd wanted back when I thought success meant climbing their ladder. I thanked Patricia for the recommendation and told her I needed a few days to think about it, which was corporate speak for I need to figure out what I actually want versus what my ego wants. That night, I sat in my new apartment, 2 bedrooms now, with actual furniture I'd chosen rather than inherited, in a building with a doorman and working heat, and tried to untangle the complicated emotions the offer had stirred up. 2 years ago, a VP title at Hartwell would have felt like winning the lottery, like finally receiving the recognition I'd been desperate for. But now it felt like a trap dressed up as an opportunity, a golden cage that would require me to abandon the thing I'd built in exchange for security and status within someone else's system. I pulled out my notebook, the same one where I'd first sketched out Elevate's business plan, and made 2 columns: reasons to take the job, reasons to decline. The take it column filled quickly with practical arguments: salary, benefits, stability, the satisfaction of proving Gregory and everyone else wrong. The decline column had only 1 entry, but it outweighed everything else. You'd be working for them again instead of yourself. I called my sister the next morning, catching her during her lunch break, and laid out the situation. She listened without interrupting, the way she always had since we were kids, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment before responding. "Terence, remember when Daddy was dying and he made us promise we'd never let anyone make us small? He didn't mean physically, he meant spiritually, emotionally. He meant never shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be." Her voice cracked slightly. "You spent 4 years making yourself small at that company, and the last 2 years becoming yourself. Why would you go back?" She was right, and I'd known she would be, but I'd needed to hear someone else say it. I thanked her, hung up, and called Patricia back within the hour. "I'm honored by the offer," I told her honestly, "but I'm going to decline. Elevate is where I need to be, building something from scratch, serving people who need what I'm teaching, controlling my own direction." But I appreciate you thinking of me." Patricia was quiet for a beat, then laughed softly. "I figured you'd say that. Honestly, I hoped you would. The world doesn't need another VP at Hartwell Consulting. It needs more people building what you're building." The decision to decline freed something in me I hadn't realized was still constrained. For 2 years I'd been building Elevate, but part of me had still been seeking validation from the corporate world that had rejected me, measuring my success against their standards, checking to see if they noticed, waiting for acknowledgement I no longer needed. Turning down that VP role was the final severance, the moment I fully committed to my own path, regardless of how it looked to anyone else. I celebrated by doing something I hadn't done in 3 years. I took a full week off. No laptop, no email, no checking in on the business every 2 hours. I flew to Atlanta, spent time with my sister and her family, took my nephews to the park, and didn't think once about leadership development or curriculum design. On my last night there, my sister and I sat on her back porch drinking wine while her kids played in the yard, and she said something that stuck with me. "You know what's different about you now? You're not trying to prove anything anymore. You just are." I realized she was right. The desperate hunger that had driven me for years had transformed into quiet confidence, and that shift had changed everything. I returned to Chicago in October, energized and clear-headed, ready to take Elevate to the next level. The business had proven the model worked. Now I needed to scale it intelligently without losing what made it effective. I hired a curriculum designer to help systematize our training, so we weren't reinventing materials for every client, brought on a sales director to handle business development while I focused on delivery quality, and started exploring technology solutions that could extend our reach beyond in-person training. By November, we'd launched our first digital product, a self-paced leadership fundamentals course priced at $400 that allowed us to serve people who couldn't afford or access our live programs. It sold 200 copies in the first month, which meant $80,000 in revenue from a product I'd built once and could sell infinitely. The margins were incredible, and more importantly, it democratized access to development in ways that felt aligned with my original mission, making leadership skills available to people the system overlooked. December brought a phone call that felt like the universe closing a circle I'd started walking 2 years earlier. It was from a recruiter representing a venture capital firm interested in investing in Elevate, not to acquire us, but to fuel expansion into a national training platform. They were offering $3 million for 25% equity, which would value my company at $12 million and give me resources to scale faster than bootstrapping would allow. The offer was compelling in ways that made my head spin, but it also terrified me. Taking venture capital meant answering to investors, hitting aggressive growth targets, potentially compromising the intimate, high-touch approach that made our training effective. I spent a week doing due diligence on the firm, talking to founders they'd backed, reading the fine print of term sheets, and ultimately decided to decline. Not because the offer was bad, but because I'd learned something crucial from extreme ownership. That real control means being willing to grow slower in exchange for staying true to your principles. Elevate would grow at its own pace, profitable and sustainable, serving people rather than investors. That was my choice, and I could make it because I owned the company completely. That ownership, literal and metaphorical, was worth more than any valuation. By January, marking 2 full years since I'd walked out of Hartwell Consulting, Elevate Leadership Institute had trained over 500 people across 12 companies, with a waiting list that stretched 3 months out. The testimonials kept pouring in, each one representing someone who'd transformed their career by developing skills their organizations had assumed they either had or didn't. Marcus, my first hire, had grown into an exceptional facilitator and was now training other trainers, multiplying our impact in ways I couldn't have achieved alone. Our team had expanded to 8 full-time people and a network of 15 contract facilitators, all of them committed to the mission of democratizing leadership development. The office in the West Loop had become too small, so we moved into a larger space in River North, with room for multiple training sessions to run simultaneously. Walking through those doors every morning still gave me a jolt of pride mixed with disbelief. This thing I'd built in desperation had become real, sustainable, and genuinely helpful to hundreds of people who'd needed exactly what I was offering. The most unexpected development came in February when I received an email from a documentary filmmaker named Rachel who'd heard about my story through one of her clients who'd gone through Elevate. She wanted to make a short film about people who'd been told they lacked potential and proved everyone wrong. Not a puff piece, but a real examination of how corporate culture crushes ambition and what it takes to rebuild yourself outside that system. I was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with that level of visibility, but she convinced me that my story could help other people trapped where I'd been trapped. We spent 3 months filming, interviews with me, with former participants, with my team, even a carefully negotiated conversation with Gregory where he spoke candidly about his own failures as a leader. The final film, titled Extreme Ownership, Stories of Self-Made Leaders, premiered at a corporate leadership conference in May and went viral within the professional development community. Within 2 weeks, it had been viewed 400,000 times on YouTube, and my inbox exploded with messages from people saying they'd been living my story and hadn't realized they could write a different ending. The attention brought opportunities I had never imagined. A major business publisher reached out asking if I'd write a book about developing leadership in people organizations overlook. A TED conference invited me to speak about ownership and potential. 3 universities wanted me to guest lecture in their MBA programs. Fortune 500 companies that would never have taken my call 2 years ago were now reaching out asking about enterprise-level partnerships. Every opportunity required careful evaluation, which ones aligned with Elevate's mission, which ones were just vanity metrics, which ones would genuinely help more people access development they needed. I turned down more than I accepted, staying focused on sustainable growth, rather than explosive expansion that could compromise quality. Extreme ownership had taught me that discipline means choosing what you won't do as much as what you will, and I'd applied that lesson religiously to protect what I'd built. The moment that felt most like completion came on a Wednesday afternoon in June when Patricia called with news that made me sit down hard in my office chair. Hartwell Consulting's board had decided to remove Gregory from his management role, not fire him, but move him into an advisory position with no direct reports. After employee feedback revealed that despite his improvement, his leadership style remained a significant barrier to retention and performance. His replacement would be someone I'd trained, a woman named Keisha, who'd been told 2 years ago she wasn't ready, but had developed into one of the strongest leaders in the company. She starts next month, Patricia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Everything she learned about leadership, she learned from you. Gregory will be reporting to someone you trained. I thought you'd want to know. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there processing the perfect symmetry of that outcome. I hadn't destroyed Gregory or sought revenge. I'd simply built something better and watched the natural consequences unfold. I called Keisha that evening to congratulate her, and she answered on the second ring, her voice buzzing with excited nervousness. "Terence, I'm terrified. What if I'm not actually ready? What if I fail?" I smiled, recognizing that fear from my own journey. "You're ready. Not because you're perfect, nobody is, but because you've developed the skills and mindset that make someone capable of learning from leadership challenges rather than being destroyed by them. Remember what we talked about in the program. Leadership isn't about knowing everything. It's about creating conditions for your team to thrive even when you don't have all the answers." She was quiet for a moment, then let out a breath. "Thank you for believing in me when nobody else did, for teaching me that potential isn't something you're born with. It's something you build." We talked for another 20 minutes about her transition plan, and when we hung up I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been chasing for years without naming it: legacy. I wasn't just building a business anymore. I was creating ripple effects that would outlive me, developing leaders who would develop other leaders, changing organizational cultures one transformed person at a time. By September, 3 years after that devastating performance review, Elevate Leadership Institute had become something I could barely recognize from its humble beginnings in my one-bedroom apartment. We'd trained over 200 people across 23 companies, generated $2.4 million in annual revenue, and maintained a 94% satisfaction rate with measurable impact on participants' careers. 38% had been promoted within 18 months of completing our program, and retention rates among our alumni were 45% higher than industry averages. The digital course had sold over 3,000 copies, reaching people in 17 countries who'd never have accessed leadership development otherwise. My team had grown to 12 full-time employees and 30 contract facilitators, all of them sharing the mission of making leadership skills accessible to people the system had written off. We'd been featured in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Forbes, not as a feel-good story, but as a legitimate case study in effective leadership development. The success was beyond anything I'd dared imagine when I'd sat on that office floor reading Extreme Ownership and decided to bet everything on myself. What surprised me most wasn't the external success, though that was gratifying, but how much I'd changed internally through the process of building Elevate. The angry, desperate version of myself who'd walked out of Gregory's office 3 years ago had transformed into someone calmer, more confident, more interested in impact than validation. I no longer checked LinkedIn obsessively to see who was getting promoted, or to compare my trajectory against former colleagues. I didn't need Gregory or Hartwell or anyone from that world to acknowledge what I'd built, because the work itself and the people it helped were acknowledgement enough. The hunger that had driven me for so long had matured into purpose, and that shift had made me not just more successful, but genuinely happier. I woke up excited about work most days, not because I was chasing something, but because I was building something meaningful. That distinction, chasing versus building, had been the key to everything. The book I'd been working on for 18 months, titled Reclaiming Leadership: How to Develop Potential Organizations Overlook, launched in October to surprisingly strong sales and reviews. It wasn't a bestseller, I hadn't written it to be, but it reached the people who needed it most. Mid-level managers stuck in organizations that undervalued them, ambitious professionals told they weren't leadership material, anyone who'd been made to feel small and was looking for permission to become larger. The most meaningful feedback came not from industry leaders or famous entrepreneurs, but from readers who sent emails saying the book had given them courage to quit soul-crushing jobs, start their own ventures, or simply advocate for themselves in ways they'd been afraid to before. One woman wrote, "I was 2 weeks from giving up on my career entirely when I found your book. Now I'm 6 months into building my own consulting practice and finally feel like myself again. Thank you for showing me it was possible." Messages like that reminded me why I'd started this journey in the first place. Not to get rich or famous, but to prove that potential wasn't fixed and leadership could be learned by anyone willing to do the work. The final piece of closure came on a cold November evening when I received an unexpected email from Gregory with the subject line, "Congratulations and gratitude." I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was some corporate pleasantry, but curiosity won out. The message was longer than I'd expected and more vulnerable than I thought Gregory capable of writing. He congratulated me on the book launch and Elevate's success, but then shifted into something deeper. "Watching what you've built has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own leadership and the damage I caused by treating potential as something to judge rather than develop. I've spent the last year in therapy working through why I felt threatened by talented people instead of being energized by them, and I'm slowly learning to lead differently. I'll never be as good at this as you are. It doesn't come naturally to me the way it seems to for you, but I'm trying. I wanted you to know that your success hasn't just vindicated you, it's educated people like me who needed to learn what leadership actually looks like. Thank you for that lesson, even though I resisted it for far too long." I sat with that email for a long time, reading it multiple times, feeling something complex and hard to name. Not quite forgiveness. Gregory's apology, however sincere, couldn't erase the damage his words had caused, but maybe something better, understanding that we'd both been trapped in different ways by a system that treated leadership as innate rather than developed, that ranked people quickly and permanently, that crushed potential instead of cultivating it. Gregory had been as much a victim of that system as I had, just from a different position in the hierarchy. His transformation, incomplete as it might be, mattered not because it absolved him, but because it proved that even people who'd internalized toxic leadership could learn better if they were willing to confront their own failures. I wrote back a short reply. I appreciate you sharing that. The work of becoming better leaders never ends. We're all just at different points on the same journey. Keep going. It wasn't warm or effusive, but it was honest, and honesty felt more important than performance. As I sit here now, 3 years removed from the worst professional moment of my life, I want to tell you something important. The person who tells you that you lack potential is often just revealing their own limitations, not yours. Gregory couldn't see my leadership capability because he'd never developed his own. He'd been promoted into management without training, rewarded for individual performance without learning how to develop others, and he'd spent years perpetuating the same broken system that had failed him. When he looked at me, he didn't see someone lacking potential. He saw a mirror reflecting back his own insecurities about whether he actually deserved the authority he wielded. That wasn't my problem to solve, and it's not yours either. Your job isn't to convince people who can't see your value that you're valuable. Your job is to develop yourself so thoroughly that their blindness becomes irrelevant. Read Extreme Ownership, or any book that teaches you to take responsibility for your life, instead of waiting for rescue. Build skills in silence while everyone else is talking about their plans. Create value that speaks louder than any title or credential could. Bet on yourself when the system tells you to stay small, because the system profits from your compliance and loses when you discover your actual capabilities. 3 years ago, my boss told me I lacked the potential to lead. Today, he reports to leaders I trained. And my company teaches thousands of people the skills he never learned. That's not revenge, that's resurrection. That's what happens when you stop asking for permission and start taking ownership. Now go prove everyone wrong, not by talking about it, but by building something they can't ignore. I'll be here, still teaching, still growing, still refusing to let anyone else define my ceiling. And when you make it, not if, when, reach back and pull someone else up. That's what real leaders do.